Hi, and welcome to Module 2 of the Introduction to a Framework for K-12 Science Education, and this module covers disciplinary core ideas. The goals for this module are that participants will understand the distribution of topics within the disciplinary core ideas, gain practice navigating individual topics, identify ways in which the material in the framework can support their current instruction. The module will go over the disciplinary core ideas included in the framework, and as we talked about in Module 1, one of the guiding principles of the framework was to limit the topics covered to core ideas and principles. And this is really important because it allows us to go to greater depth about these topics, which gives students a better foundation for life. One of my favorite quotes from the framework is, "An important role of science education is not to teach all the facts, but rather to prepare students with sufficient core knowledge that they can later acquire additional information on their own." Now, some of you may be thinking as we go over these topics how they decided on them, why things were included, why other things might not have been included. And at the end of the presentation, we'll go over the 4 criteria that the authors used to determine whether or not things would be included in the framework. The disciplinary core ideas can be broadly grouped into 3 major categories: the life sciences, the physical sciences, and earth and space sciences. And just as a preview for reflection, I want to mention here that we're going to be going over each of the disciplinary core ideas, which there are 11 of, and each of the topics within the disciplinary core ideas, which there are almost 40 of those. There'll be a lot of information. At the end of the presentation, you'll be asked to select 3 topics that you either teach or are interested in teaching, and read about them in more detail within the framework. There is a reference document you can download to follow along during the presentation. This document lists each of the DCIs and topics, so I encourage you, if you haven't downloaded that, to pause and download that document to be able to either take some notes or just have something to refer back to. So the first category of DCIs are the physical sciences, and within this we have 4 disciplinary core ideas. PS1, matter and its interactions. PS2, motion and stability, forces and interactions. PS3, energy. And PS4, waves and their application to technologies for information transfer. So the first one, PS1, matter and its interactions. The overarching question for this disciplinary core idea is, how can one explain the structure, properties, and interactions of matter? Within this, there are 3 topics. PS1A is the structure and properties of matter, and this really deals with the idea of how do particles combine to form the variety of matter that we observe. PS1B is chemical reactions, and this addresses questions of how substances combine or change, react to make new substances, and how we can characterize and explain these reactions and make predictions about them. PS1C is the nuclear processes, and here we're really looking at what force holds nuclei together and mediates nuclear processes. PS2, motion and stability, forces and interaction. The overarching question for this core idea is, how can we explain and predict interactions between objects and within systems of objects? And within this, there are 3 topics. PS2A is forces and motion. And this addresses the question of how we can predict an object's continued motion, its changes in motion, or its stability. PS2B is types of interactions, and what we're looking at here is what underlying forces explain the variety of interactions that we can observe. PS2C is stability and instability in physical systems, and this really looks at why are some physical systems more stable than others. PS3 is energy. And the overarching question for the core idea of energy is, how is energy transferred and conserved? And this is one of the more interdisciplinary topics within the framework. Within energy, the first topic is PS3A, definitions of energy, which addresses what is energy. PS3B, conservation of energy and energy transfer. And this deals with questions of what we mean by conservation of energy and how is energy transferred between objects or between systems. PS3C is relationship between energy and forces, which addresses how forces relate to energy. And PS3D is energy and chemical processes in everyday life, where we talk about how food and fuel can provide energy, and then if energy is conserved, why do people say it's produced or used? So you can see I said that this is one of the more interdisciplinary topics. You can see that we definitely have chemistry and physics coming together here, but we also are going to deal with some aspects of biology and the question of how energy relates to life. PS4 is waves and their application to technologies for information transfer. This is one of the areas of expanded content. We definitely see some information included in the framework here that isn't included in our current standards and that most states don't include, and many curriculum don't include in their current materials. The overarching question for this core idea is, how are waves used to transfer energy and information? So the first topic within this is PS4A, wave properties, which addresses what the characteristics and behaviors of waves are. And this is pretty traditional content as far as thinking about what a wave is and what the properties of the wave are. PS4B is electromagnetic radiation. And what we're really thinking about here is, what is light? How can we explain the varied effects that involve light? And then what other forms of electromagnetic radiation are there? Which again, this is pretty traditional content as far as waves, that we would address the electromagnetic spectrum, specifically what light, and look at some really unique features that happen when light passes boundaries. What's new is this focus that we see in PS4C of information technologies and instrumentation, where we address the question of how instruments that transmit and detect waves use to extend human senses. And so really, how is it that we're using waves and wave properties to transfer information and to have these technologies that extend our human abilities? That leads us into the life sciences, where there are 4 disciplinary core ideas. LS1 is from molecules to organisms, structure, and LS2 is ecosystems, interactions, energy, and dynamics. LS3 is heredity, inheritance, and variation of traits. And LS4 is biological evolution, unity, and diversity. And these are all topics that would traditionally be covered in a biology or life sciences course. LS1, from molecules to organisms, structure, and processes, the overarching question is, how do organisms live, grow, respond to their environment, and reproduce? So there are 4 main topics here. LS1A is structure and function, which addresses how the structure of organisms enables life's functions, which is a pretty broad topic and can really expand into all different types of structure and function within an organism. LS1B is the growth and development of organisms, and this really addresses how organisms grow and develop. LS1C is organism for matter and organization for matter and energy flow in organisms, and this addresses the question of how organisms obtain and use the matter and energy they need to live and grow. You can definitely see a parallel there to the discussion of energy that happens in PS3. And LS1D is information processing, and this addresses how organisms detect, process, and use information about the environment. So you can see a connection back to structure and function with that, because some question of how information processing happens relates to structure and function. We also see a connection from this back to that question of how we use waves to extend our ability to take in information. LS2, ecosystems, interactions, energy, and dynamics, is the second core idea in life sciences, and the overarching question here is, how and why do organisms interact with their environment, and what are the effects of these interactions? Within this, we have 4 topics. LS2A is interdependent relationships in ecosystems, which addresses how organisms interact with the living and non-living environments to obtain matter and energy. LS2B is cycles of matter and energy transfer in ecosystems, and this asks the question of how matter and energy move through an ecosystem. LS2C is ecosystem dynamics, functioning, and resilience. And this addresses questions of what happens to ecosystems when the environment changes. And then LS2D is social interactions and group behavior, where we talk about things like, how do organisms interact in groups so as to benefit individuals, and why do we form those groups? You can definitely see here that we again kind of go back to that question of the cycling of matter, the cycling of energy, and the movement through an ecosystem, which makes that pretty strong tie back into PS3. LS3 is heredity, inheritance, and variation of traits. And there are two questions for this. How are the characteristics of one generation passed on to the next? And how can individuals of the same species and even siblings have different characteristics? And I want to make a kind of big picture distinction between LS3 and what we'll talk about in LS4, which is about a bigger picture change, that LS3 really addresses the very small picture of change between one generation and the next, or variation within one generation, and not the big long picture of many generations, and what change looks like across many generations. And so often people have some question about where the line is, and what belongs in heredity and inheritance and variation of traits. And I find it useful to think of it as it has to either be a question of within a generation or from one generation to the next and not beyond that. So the first topic here is inheritance of traits, and that question is how are the characteristics of one generation related to the previous generation? And the second topic is variation of traits, and that really addresses the piece about how individuals of the same species vary and how they look, function, and behave. Which brings us to LS4, which is the last disciplinary core idea in biology, which is biological evolution, unity, and diversity. The overarching question is how can there be so many similarities among organisms, yet so many different kinds of plants, animals, and microorganisms? And then how does biodiversity affect humans? And again, when we're looking at what belongs in heredity and what belongs here, questions of within the same generation across many species belong in biological evolution, or changes across many generations belong in biological evolution, whereas differences between individuals in the same generation of the same species, or differences between a generation and the one before after it, belongs in inheritance. So there are 4 topics here. LS4A is evidence of common ancestry and diversity. And the essential question is what evidence shows that different species are related? LS4B is natural selection, and this addresses questions of how genetic variation among organisms affects their survival and their reproduction. LS4C is really that question of how the environment influences populations of organisms over multiple generations. And LS4D, biodiversity in humans, is really about what is biodiversity? How do we affect it as humans, and how does it affect us as humans? Why is that biodiversity important for us? That takes us to Earth and Space Sciences, which is the third grouping of DCIs, and that has 3 disciplinary core ideas in it: Earth's place in the universe, Earth systems, and Earth and human activity. So Earth's place in the universe, the overarching question is what is the universe and what is our place in it? ESS1A is about the universe and its stars and really addresses the question of what is the universe and what goes on in its stars. ESS1B is the Earth and the solar system, and that addresses what are the predictable patterns caused by Earth's movement in the solar system, which is both of those, the universe and its stars and Earth and its solar system, are things that are currently included in our standards, but it's maybe a different way of approaching that question. Instead of just what is our solar system, it's what patterns are caused by our movement. And then the third one is the history of planet Earth, which addresses ideas about how people reconstruct and date events in Earth's planetary history. ESS2 is Earth systems, and the question here is how and why is the Earth constantly changing? And this one actually has 5 main topics. It's the only one with that many. The first is ESS2A, Earth systems and materials, which addresses questions of how Earth's major systems interact with each other. ESS2B is plate tectonics and large-scale system interactions, and that really addresses how do the continents move and what causes earthquakes and volcanoes. ESS2C is the roles of water in Earth systems and processes, and that addresses questions of how the properties and movements of water shape Earth's surface and affect its systems. ESS2D is weather and climate, where we think about what regulates the weather and what regulates climate. And ESS 2E is biogeology, which really forces us to step back and think about how living organisms alter Earth's processes and structures. ESS 3 is Earth and human activity, and this topic is something that is addressed a little bit in our current standards, both in the question of the history of science and technology relating to science, and then also is a little bit addressed in the topic of earth science, but primarily the way this has been addressed in our standards in the past is not with earth science. It's more that question of history and technology and impact of science. The overarching question for Earth and human activity is, how do Earth's surface processes and human activities affect each other? There are 4 topics. ESS 3A is natural resources, where we address the question of how do humans depend on Earth's resources. ESS 3B is natural hazards, where we think about how natural hazards affect individuals and societies, which is something we've had a lot of opportunities to think about lately. ESS 3C is human impacts on Earth systems, and the question here is, how do humans change the planet? And ESS 3D is global climate change, where we question how do we model and predict the effects of human activities on Earth's climate. So I promised at the beginning that we would address how the disciplinary core ideas were selected, and the key criteria they used for selection were included in the framework, and the authors stated that they required each DCI to meet at least 2 of these criteria. They preferred for it to meet 3 or 4, but it had to meet at least 2. So the 4 criteria are that the topic had to have broad importance across multiple sciences or engineering disciplines to be a key organizing principle of a single discipline. It needed to provide a key tool for understanding or investigating more complex ideas and solving problems. It needed to relate to the interests and life experiences of students or be connected to societal or personal concerns that require scientific or technological knowledge. And it needed to be teachable and learnable over multiple grades and increasing levels of depth and sophistication. That is, the idea can be made accessible to younger students, but is broad enough to sustain continued investigation over years. Now, each of those almost 40 topics that I just shared a kind of organizing question for are each addressed in their own section in the framework. The chapters are broken apart into physical science, life science, and earth and space science, but then within those chapters there's a section for each of the DCIs, but then also for each of the topics within the DCIs. And those sections have the questions that I read listed. They have a description of the disciplinary core idea, and then they have some grade band endpoints of where students should be in regards to that topic at different points in the K-12 experience. So your reflection, you're going to be asked to select 3 topics of the topics we just went over and read about them in the framework. Then you'll be asked to reflect on whether or not it contains the material you currently teach or that you would expect to teach, and explain why you think it does or doesn't match that expectation. And then you'll be asked to identify which of the DCI inclusion criteria you believe that topic met in order to be included. And remember, they believe it met at least 2 of those. You'll be asked to reflect generally on the structure and organization of the information presented, the questions, the description, the grade band endpoints, and kind of reflect on how this supports your learning and your understanding as a teacher. And then the 4th thing you'll be asked to reflect on is how you can use this section of the framework as a supplement to enhance or improve your existing materials. And I just want to close with one of my favorite quotes from the framework, and this ties back to this idea that we're using a limited number of ideas, which can be challenging as we think about what we're used to teaching. An education focused on a limited set of ideas and practices should enable students to continue their development well beyond their K-12 school years as science learners, users of scientific knowledge, and perhaps also as producers of such knowledge. And so I hope that as we think about these disciplinary core ideas, that we can be really inspired to think about going deep on these foundational principles to ensure that our students can really find success later.